tectonic plates of global power are shifting, and nowhere is this more evident than across the African continent. For decades, the International Monetary Fund and World Bank wielded their financial instruments like colonial administrators, dictating economic policy from their ivory towers in Washington, treating sovereign nations as wayward children in need of guidance. But something extraordinary is happening in 2025. Something that has these institutions scrambling to maintain relevance in a world that no longer automatically defers to their authority. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré addressed his nation after the transformative events in Burkina Faso, his words resonated far beyond the borders of his country. Here was a young African leader, articulating with crystalline clarity what millions across the continent had long understood: that genuine sovereignty cannot coexist with perpetual financial vassalage. His emergence represents more than a change in leadership. It symbolizes the awakening of a generation that refuses to accept the inherited constraints of neocolonial dependency. The narrative we've been fed for generations is crumbling. The story that positioned these Bretton Woods institutions as benevolent guardians of global economic stability is being rewritten by African voices who understand that stability built on exploitation is merely organized injustice. The IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs, those infamous prescriptions of austerity and privatization, are being recognized for what they always were: sophisticated mechanisms of resource extraction disguised as development assistance. Consider the mathematical absurdity of Africa's relationship with these institutions. The continent that houses approximately 60% of the world's mineral wealth, that feeds global supply chains with everything from cobalt to cocoa, somehow requires perpetual borrowing to fund basic infrastructure. This paradox isn't the result of African incompetence or corruption, though corrupt leaders certainly exist and must be held accountable, but rather the logical outcome of a system designed to maintain dependency. The youth of Africa, comprising the largest demographic cohort on the planet, are asking uncomfortable questions that previous generations were discouraged from voicing. They're examining the legacy of structural adjustment programs that privatized water systems in Ghana, dismantled food security programs in Malawi, and forced the closure of domestic industries across the Sahel. They're connecting these policies to the current reality, where African nations export raw materials at artificially depressed prices while importing finished goods at premium rates. This awakening isn't confined to any single region or ideology. From Addis Ababa to Accra, from Kigali to Kinshasa, a new discourse is emerging that centers African agency and wisdom. The leaders who embody this shift, figures like Traoré, but also visionaries across the continent who prioritize their people's welfare over external approval, represent a fundamental break with the politics of accommodation that characterized much of the post-independence era. The economic foundation of this transformation is as solid as it is revolutionary. African nations are increasingly recognizing that their demographic dividend, a young, educated, and digitally connected population, combined with their resource endowments and growing consumer markets, provides unprecedented leverage in global negotiations. The traditional model where African nations competed against each other for foreign investment and loans is being replaced by coordinated approaches that maximize collective bargaining power. Regional integration is accelerating at an unprecedented pace. The African Continental Free Trade Area, despite its imperfections and ongoing challenges, represents the world's largest free trade zone by participating countries. This isn't merely about reducing tariffs. It's about creating the economic infrastructure necessary for true sovereignty. When African nations trade primarily with each other, using African currencies and African financial institutions, the coercive power of external creditors diminishes dramatically. The technological revolution is providing tools that previous generations of African leaders could only dream of. Blockchain technology is enabling direct, transparent transactions that bypass traditional banking systems. Mobile money platforms, pioneered in Kenya, but now spreading across the continent, demonstrate how African innovation can leapfrog Western financial infrastructure entirely. These aren't just technological curiosities, they're weapons of economic liberation. China's emergence as an alternative source of development finance has fundamentally altered the global landscape. While Chinese investment brings its own challenges and must be approached with strategic caution, it has broken the monopoly that Western financial institutions once enjoyed. African leaders can now choose between competing offers, negotiate more favorable terms, and avoid the humiliating conditionalities that characterize traditional aid relationships. The media narrative surrounding these changes reveals the desperation of institutions losing their grip on power. Western outlets consistently frame African sovereignty movements in terms of instability and authoritarianism, rarely acknowledging the democratic mandate that many of these leaders possess, or the popular support for policies that prioritize national interests over foreign approval. This propaganda campaign isn't accidental. It's a deliberate attempt to undermine African confidence and legitimacy. But the information landscape has been democratized. African voices can now reach global audiences directly, without editorial filtering by Western media gatekeepers. Social media platforms, continental news networks, and independent journalists are providing alternative narratives that center African perspectives and experiences. The days when a single BBC documentary or CNN report could define global perception of African events are ending. The younger generation of Africans, those born after independence, approach these institutions with fundamental skepticism rather than inherited deference. They understand that the IMF's emphasis on fiscal responsibility rings hollow when applied to nations that were systematically underdeveloped through centuries of extraction. They recognize that World Bank development projects often benefit foreign contractors more than local communities. This generational shift is producing leaders who speak the language of sovereignty fluently. When these leaders reject conditional aid or withdraw from international agreements that compromise national interests, they're not acting impulsively. They're implementing sophisticated strategies based on careful analysis of cost-benefit calculations that previous generations were discouraged from conducting. The resource curse theory, long used to explain African underdevelopment, is being exposed as intellectual colonialism. The notion that natural resource abundance inevitably leads to corruption and conflict conveniently ignores the role of foreign corporations and governments in fostering these conditions. African nations are increasingly asserting direct control over their resources, negotiating better terms with multinationals, and ensuring that resource revenues benefit their populations rather than foreign shareholders. Financial sovereignty is becoming a central pillar of this transformation. The establishment of continental financial institutions, the increasing use of local currencies in trade, and the development of African credit rating agencies are all components of a comprehensive strategy to reduce dependence on Western financial systems. These initiatives face significant challenges, but their mere existence represents a fundamental shift in approach. The agricultural revolution taking place across Africa demonstrates how sovereignty principles apply beyond extractive industries. Nations are prioritizing food security over export agriculture, supporting small farmers rather than multinational agribusiness, and developing local value chains that keep more wealth within their borders. This shift challenges decades of World Bank agricultural policies that prioritized cash crops for export over food security for local populations. Education and healthcare policies are similarly being reoriented around African priorities rather than external recommendations. The brain drain that has plagued the continent for generations is beginning to reverse as African nations create conditions that retain and attract talent. This human capital development is essential for sustained sovereignty because it reduces dependence on foreign expertise and creates domestic capacity for complex decision-making. The environmental dimension of this sovereignty movement deserves particular attention. African nations are rejecting the false choice between development and environmental protection imposed by international institutions. Instead, they're pioneering approaches that recognize traditional ecological knowledge, prioritize sustainable development models suited to African contexts, and resist environmental policies designed in Western contexts that may not be appropriate for African realities. Cultural sovereignty underpins all these practical changes. The resurgence of African languages in education and governance, the celebration of traditional knowledge systems, and the integration of African philosophical frameworks into policymaking all contribute to a comprehensive assertion of civilizational confidence. This cultural renaissance isn't about rejecting useful knowledge from other continents. It's about approaching such knowledge as equals rather than supplicants. The Pan-African dimension of this transformation cannot be understated. Continental institutions are gaining credibility and effectiveness as alternatives to Western-dominated international organizations. The African Union's conflict resolution mechanisms, continental trade agreements, and shared infrastructure projects all demonstrate growing capacity for collective action that reduces reliance on external mediation and financing. Military sovereignty is another crucial component often overlooked in discussions of economic independence. The reduction of Western military bases, the development of continental security arrangements, and the assertion of control over domestic security affairs all contribute to the broader sovereignty project. Nations cannot be economically independent while remaining militarily dependent. The response from traditional power centers reveals the significance of these changes. Diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and media campaigns targeting African leaders who assert sovereignty demonstrate that these moves are having their intended effect. The intensity of the pushback confirms that genuine change is occurring, not merely cosmetic political theater. Democratic legitimacy provides the foundation for sustainable sovereignty. Leaders who enjoy genuine popular support, who deliver tangible improvements in living standards, and who demonstrate accountability to their citizens possess the political capital necessary to withstand external pressure. This is why distinguishing between genuine sovereignty movements and opportunistic power grabs remains essential. Only leaders with authentic democratic mandates can sustain the sacrifices that sovereignty sometimes requires. The economic data supports the viability of this sovereignty agenda. African economies that have reduced their dependence on IMF and World Bank programming have generally experienced more stable growth, lower income inequality, and greater political stability. This empirical evidence challenges the theoretical foundations of structural adjustment policies and provides blueprints for other nations considering similar paths. Regional success stories provide concrete examples of what sovereignty looks like in practice. Ethiopia's rejection of IMF conditionalities while pursuing ambitious infrastructure development, Rwanda's focus on domestic resource mobilization rather than aid dependence, and Botswana's transformation of diamond wealth into broader economic development all demonstrate alternative models of African development. The technological leapfrogging occurring across Africa provides tools for implementing sovereignty that weren't available to previous generations. Digital currencies, renewable energy systems, and advanced communications technologies all enable African nations to build modern economies without relying on Western technological platforms or financial systems. As we witness this historic transformation, it becomes clear that the question isn't whether Africa can achieve genuine sovereignty. It's how quickly this transition will occur, and what obstacles remaining colonial structures will place in its path. The mathematical impossibility of perpetual debt servicing, the unsustainability of resource extraction models, and the demographic reality of a young, educated, and increasingly connected population all point toward inevitable change. The IMF and World Bank's inability to force compliance isn't a temporary phenomenon. It's the logical result of shifting global power dynamics that favor larger, more integrated economies with diverse trading partners. These institutions must adapt to this new reality or face increasing irrelevance as African nations pursue alternative development strategies. This moment requires our active participation and support. Every view, every share, every conversation about African sovereignty contributes to changing the global narrative about what's possible for our continent. The leaders pioneering this transformation need to know they have the backing of a global African diaspora and allies who understand that African liberation benefits humanity as a whole. The future being written by this generation of African leaders offers hope not just for Africa, but for a more equitable global order where sovereignty is respected, where development occurs on terms defined by the people who will live with its consequences, and where the artificial hierarchies of the colonial era finally give way to genuine partnership between equals. If this analysis resonates with your understanding of the changes sweeping across Africa, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your engagement isn't just about algorithm optimization, it's about building the digital infrastructure necessary to amplify African voices in global conversations. Hit the notification bell to stay informed about developments in this ongoing sovereignty movement, and share this content with others who need to understand the magnitude of the transformation currently underway. The revolution isn't just being televised. It's being lived, breathed, and implemented by millions of Africans who refuse to accept inherited limitations on their potential. Subscribe now to remain connected to this historic moment, and let's continue building the networks of solidarity that will support Africa's march toward genuine, comprehensive sovereignty.